Jasmine Crockett destroys Pam Bondi's fake struggle story without raising her voice. She called it a struggle, said her childhood was hard. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, sat in the hearing room, flawless makeup designer blazer, recounting stories of canned beans and summer heat without air conditioning. The microphones picked up every word. Some nodded, others froze. But behind her, a young black woman blinked slowly. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here for show. She had heard versions of this story before, how discomfort could be mistaken for oppression, how privilege learned to mimic pain. And yet Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even move. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to speak first. It only needs to wait. What followed was not a shouting match. It wasn't dramatic in the way you expect. No one stood up and stormed out. But when Jasmine finally did speak, just 14 words long, the room changed. The internet followed. And so did the truth. It began on a Wednesday. The committee room was like any other cream-colored walls, polished wood panels, American flags standing sentry at each corner. Microphones lined the table. The temperature was a notch too cold, as if nerves weren't already doing the job. But this time something felt different. Pam Bondi sat under the bright lights. Her blazer was flawless, her speech rehearsed, her tone calibrated to land somewhere between sincerity and strength. She began with gratitude, thanking the committee, the chairwoman, and even her critics. Then she pivoted. She told her story. We didn't have much, she began. There were nights when dinner was just canned beans. Our air conditioner didn't work one summer. We made do. She painted a picture, not of hardship, but of endurance. A suburban girl's version of struggle, clean, manageable. No one interrupted, but across the table Jasmine Crockett blinked. She had heard this before. Not the details, but the melody. Of discomfort disguised as deprivation. Of privilege performing humility. Pam continued. That experience made me strong. It taught me how to push through. That's what this country needs. Resilience. Jasmine's fingers tapped the edge of her folder. Once, twice. Chairs creaked. One aide coughed. And then silence. The pause lasted 3 seconds. Jasmine leaned forward. Opened her folder, pulled out a document. No performance, no introduction. Then she asked the question that changed the room. Do you want us to call that struggle? Her voice didn't rise. Her face didn't move. She wasn't dismissing Pam. She was dismantling the entire frame. You could hear a pin drop. Pam looked back, mouth open, eyes blinking once, then twice. I didn't mean to say, but the words were already loose, and Jasmine didn't need to reply. She closed the folder. The chairwoman called for a recess. Outside the hallway, filled with murmurs. One intern texted she didn't even raise her voice. Another whispered, "Did you feel that? Like the air changed?" Inside the chamber, Jasmine stayed seated, one hand on the red folder, one breath at a time. The press didn't wait. Clips appeared within the hour, edited down to those 14 words. Do you want us to call that struggle? It went viral before dinner. Overnight, TikTok lit up. Teens recreated the scene. Teachers paused class to discuss it. Podcasts broke it down frame by frame. Community centers held conversations about poverty perspective and who gets to name pain. But in D.C., the effect wasn't performance, it was political. That night, an aide from a moderate senator's office called Jasmine's staff. What else is in the folder, he asked. Jasmine smiled. Receipts. She meant it literally. The next morning she returned to the same chair, same suit, same folder. Before we begin, she said, I'd like to submit for the record utility shutoff notices from the Dallas County Housing Authority. Data from the Department of Education on lead contamination in school water. And this, she held up a faded bill, is my grandmother's electricity statement from 1984. The room froze again. No one objected. She didn't lecture, she didn't accuse. She placed the papers gently on the table and said, we can talk about struggle, but let's define it first. She paused, opened another file and added, this, she said, is a letter from a student who missed 27 days of school last year because her neighborhood has no reliable transportation. This one from a parent whose son's asthma flares every time the heating system kicks up mold. And this is a spreadsheet of school meal debt balances in underserved districts. She laid them out like exhibits, not for effect, for clarity. Struggle, Jasmine said, doesn't come with a driveway and a dishwasher. It comes with decisions no child should make, like whether to eat or stay warm. There were no rebuttals. One representative whispered to another, "She's redefining the entire hearing." Jasmine didn't gloat. She sat back and waited. Later, after the session adjourned, a journalist approached. "What would you say to those who claim you were too pointed?" Jasmine looked at him, calm, steady. "I was precise." She turned, stepped into the hallway. Outside, a young staffer stopped her. "My mom grew up in the projects," he said. "She watched your clip." She said, finally, "Someone who doesn't romanticize struggle." Jasmine nodded, no smile, just recognition. She reached into her folder, pulled out a blank card, and wrote 2 words. "Thank you." Then she walked on. The following morning, the headlines were everywhere. 14 words that stopped the room, read one. "Silence has a name," Jasmine Crockett said another. Talk shows ran segments. Analysts spun narratives. But across social media, something more raw was happening. People weren't quoting statistics. They were quoting tone. A TikTok teacher from Chicago uploaded a side-by-side video. On one side, Pam Bondi's testimony. On the other, Jasmine's question. This, the teacher said, is the difference between discomfort and disparity. The video hit 2 million views in a day. Back at Jasmine's office, her team was overwhelmed. Emails flooded in, some angry, some grateful, most of them urgent. One read, "You didn't just speak, you mirrored us." Another, "My daughter asked what struggle meant. I showed her your clip." But Jasmine stayed quiet, declined interviews. She didn't want to speak about the moment. She wanted to build on it. That weekend, she met with education advocates, urban planners, healthcare workers, not on camera, not in a press event, in church basements, in school gymnasiums, on the corner of streets still missing crosswalks. "What do you need me to carry?" she asked them. Not "what do I say?" "What do I carry?" She took notes, names, photocopies of unpaid utility bills, a list of kids suspended for tardiness due to broken public transit. The red folder got heavier. By Monday, she introduced a bill, the Truth in Equity Data Act. It required local governments to report educational, housing, and public health disparities by zip code, not district, not county, zip code. That small change meant something massive. It made struggle visible. Reporters came back, asked if her new momentum was because of a viral moment. Jasmine said simply no. It's because the moment was true. In classrooms, students began asking new kinds of questions. Why do some schools have better soap? Why can't I drink from every fountain? Why are some of our textbooks older than our teachers? And in each place Jasmine visited, someone mentioned the folder. "Did you bring it?" they'd ask. She always did. One morning she spoke at a town hall in Jackson, Mississippi. A teenager raised their hand. "Ma'am, what do you think made that moment so big?" Jasmine paused. "I think people recognized a truth they hadn't heard out loud in a long time." She paused again, and because I didn't yell, they finally heard it. The crowd nodded. Later that week, an editorial in The Atlantic described Jasmine as a new kind of rhetorician, one who uses quiet like a scalpel, not a hammer. Pam Bondi, meanwhile, made a second statement. "I respect Representative Crockett's passion. I never intended to compare experiences. It was a walk-back, not a confrontation." But the story had already moved on. The conversation wasn't about one hearing anymore. It was about the line between inconvenience and injustice, and Jasmine kept showing up. To a middle school science fair, where only half the experiments had clean water. To a meeting in a housing complex, where mold had eaten through the drywall. To a youth poetry slam, where a 12-year-old ended their verse with, "Do you want to call that struggle? Ask my fridge." The phrase had grown legs. And Jasmine, she let it walk ahead of her, because this was never about her. It was about the folder, what it carried, and who finally got to define what weight really meant. A month later, in a small auditorium in Newark, Jasmine addressed a group of high school seniors. They asked about college, about voting, about fear. Jasmine shared a new story about her own first job interview, walking past a liquor store with broken neon lights, wearing a borrowed blouse and shoes a half-size too big. "I walked in," she said, "and the receptionist looked down at my shoes before looking up at me. That was my introduction to invisibility." The students were silent. Then one said, "But you made them see you now." Jasmine smiled. No, baby, I made them see you. The following month, Jasmine kept moving. From Newark to Baltimore, from Atlanta to St. Louis, her itinerary was packed with small rooms and big voices. But everywhere she went, there was one thing she wouldn't let go of: the red folder. At a teacher union meeting in Detroit, someone asked if she'd ever run for higher office. Jasmine didn't answer directly. Instead, she held up the folder. I'm not running for office, she said. I'm running to keep these stories from sitting in someone's drawer. The crowd stood, not cheering, listening. The silence had become signature. Back in D.C., new momentum stirred. Lawmakers who once ignored education reports now requested Jasmine's briefings. Her staff was small but meticulous. They developed case studies, district-by-district disparities, red line overlays on school funding maps. She titled each document Struggle Index. It caught on. In 1 week, 3 other representatives cited it on the House floor. But it wasn't just the facts. It was the way she framed them. Struggle isn't just a statistic, she said. It's a system's reaction to silence. That quote ended up on posters, and in grant proposals, and on the whiteboard of a civics teacher in Richmond. The movement had a vocabulary now. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi disappeared from the headlines. She returned to private work. Public memory faded quickly, except for those who kept replaying the clip. But Jasmine didn't. She wasn't chasing contrast. She was chasing clarity. One evening, she was invited to a round table hosted by veterans who grew up in segregated schools. They handed her a photo, black and white corners, frayed, of a classroom with 42 kids and 1 textbook. Can I keep this? Jasmine asked. The oldest veteran nodded. It belongs in that folder now. She added it. The folder was getting heavy, but so was the responsibility. Everywhere she went, people tried to turn her into a brand. She's the quiet fire, one magazine called her. She's dignity weaponized, another headline read. But Jasmine resisted branding, because branding burns fast, and she wasn't interested in burning, she was building. In Baton Rouge, a middle school named their library's research wing the Folder Room. In Oakland, a group of high schoolers created a zine titled Voices in the Folder, and in her own district, a mural appeared overnight. Jasmine's silhouette facing away, red folder in hand. Spray painted beside it, Speak even when they can't hear. Jasmine visited the mural late one night, alone, no staff, no statement. She stood there for 10 minutes, then pulled out a Sharpie. On a nearby wall she wrote, Power Whispers. That's why they try to shout over it. She didn't tell anyone she'd done it. The next morning, students arrived and stood in line to take photos. It made the front page of the local paper, not because of the graffiti, because it made people stop. That was the theme now. To stop, to listen, to feel the heat of truth without needing the flame. Jasmine went home that night and reread every letter in the folder. She sat on her floor surrounded by them. Some handwritten, some typed. One written in pencil on a napkin. They weren't all stories of hardship. Some were dreams, blueprints, confessions of fear. And she realized her job wasn't just to carry the weight. It was to prove it mattered. She added a page to the folder that night. It said, Proof, Presence. The next morning, she submitted it to the Library of Congress. They cataloged it under Contemporary American Political Discourse. Jasmine laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was finally real. The silence wasn't a tactic anymore. It was a language. And the folder wasn't just full of papers. It was full of the fire that didn't burn, but warmed an entire room. She returned to Dallas for a weekend panel at her former community center. The room was small, carpet worn, but packed with youth from neighborhoods like hers. One asked, When did you know the folder was more than just notes? Jasmine thought for a moment. When people stopped asking what I had to say and started asking what they had to tell me. Another student said, Sometimes I feel like no one sees us. Jasmine reached into the folder and handed the student a card. On it, written in her handwriting, I see you. The world will too. They hugged her afterward. That night, she added the encounter to the folder scribbled on the back of a flyer. It read, Dallas Section C, Seat 14, Brave. She started logging them all, moments, names, fears turned into questions. A man from Tulsa, a grandmother from Newark, a girl from South LA who said, if silence works, maybe I don't have to yell to matter. And Jasmine understood silence when wielded with truth was not absence. It was presence magnified. The fire she carried wasn't loud, but it didn't flicker. It radiated, and people followed the warmth. Momentum has a rhythm. Jasmine knew this now, not from strategy memos or campaign playbooks, but from the way footsteps echoed after a truth was spoken. The sound lingered longer than applause, and in those echoes new voices rose. "Can I add something to the folder?" became a question she heard daily. Students handed her index cards, folded notebook pages, sometimes just names. Bus drivers, janitors, teachers, grandmothers, people who had never testified, who never imagined their experience belonged anywhere near Congress, now asked if they could be included. She always said yes. At a rally in Birmingham, a former coal worker handed her a brittle paycheck stub from 1972. "They docked us for lunch breaks," he said. "I want this remembered." She tucked it into the folder. In Portland, a single mom offered a drawing her son had made of their apartment with no furniture. "He doesn't know we're struggling, but I do," she whispered. In Miami, an undocumented high school valedictorian slipped Jasmine a USB drive. "My speech," she said. "They wouldn't let me read it." Jasmine stored everything. The red folder became so full it no longer closed. Her staff made copies, digitized materials. But Jasmine insisted on carrying the original. "History has a weight," she told them. "It's good for my back to feel it." She carried it into schools, libraries, courtrooms, church steps. In Philadelphia, she spoke at a juvenile justice symposium. When asked about reform, she opened the folder and read aloud a letter from a 16-year-old incarcerated for missing probation check-ins. "He wasn't late for disrespect," she said. "He was late because the bus line was cut." A judge in the audience wiped away tears. Meanwhile, legislators began pushing Jasmine's proposals further. Equity indexing became a buzzword. Silent testimony was adopted in 2 state assemblies as a format for presenting anonymized personal impact stories. Jasmine didn't care about the language. She cared that people were listening. One day a man in a suit approached her in an airport. "You're the one with the folder," he said. "Yes," she replied. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a photograph. "My mom. She cleaned this building for 27 years. No plaque, no pension. Can you take her with you?" Jasmine nodded. "She's in." The photo went between 2 pages already filled with loss and labor. That night she wrote one sentence in her journal. "I'm not archiving pain, I'm honoring persistence." The folder had become a thread connecting past to present testimony to transformation. But threads stretch, and in stretching they sometimes snap. Jasmine felt the tension rising. Media narratives grew louder, more polarized. The folder queen, the woke whisperer, silent but scathing. Everyone wanted to define her. So she disappeared for a week. No press, no tweets, no schedule. She went home. She sat with her grandmother, played old records, ate cornbread, walked her childhood street, and remembered what it felt like to be unseen, unheard, to sit in classrooms where books were torn, bathrooms were broken, but you were told just work harder. When she returned to Washington, she wasn't more polished. She was more anchored. Her next speech was at a policy summit on child welfare. No screens, no slides, just the red folder. She opened it slowly, pages crackling. "This," she said, "is a story you won't see on any balance sheet." She read a handwritten story by a foster child who'd changed 11 homes in 7 years. "I sleep with shoes," on the letter said, "because you never know when it's time to move." The room fell still. For the rest of the summit, no one used the word efficiency. Instead, they asked, "How do we create stability?" Jasmine left without waiting for applause. In the hallway, someone whispered, "She brings ghosts with her." Maybe, but Jasmine believed she brought reminders. That struggle wasn't past tense. That data had names, and that dignity could be policy. Back in her office, she reorganized the folder by theme. Now housing, education, food, insecurity, juvenile justice, forgotten labor. Each tab color-coded. Each page a reason. She began writing annotations in the margins. Pain held here, urgency, root cause, proximity to highways, generational echo. The folder became a map. A living, breathing cartography of invisible burdens. She carried it not as armor but as offering. And in her quiet, consistent way, Jasmine Crockett kept threading the red line that had started with one sentence. Do you want us to call that struggle? Now, across the country, that red line ran through policy drafts, student essays, protest banners, and sticky notes on kitchen fridges. It stitched together something larger, a movement of witness, of accountability, of hope. And still she listened, because the folder wasn't full. Not yet. And still she listened, because the folder wasn't full. Not yet. But something was shifting. One morning in her office, Jasmine found an envelope without a return address. Inside was a single Polaroid 3 children standing outside a boarded-up community center. Scribbled on the back, "Build this again." It shook her. That day she spoke with her staff. "We've done enough collecting," she said. "Now we act." They drafted the Community Restoration Initiative funds for libraries, health clinics, playgrounds with one rule. Communities chose what they needed most. No federal prescription. Jasmine brought the red folder into the committee room. "This," she said, holding it up, "is not a prop. It's a promise." Pages fluttered as she read from them, letters from children with asthma living near factories. A typed note from a retired teacher who spent her pension on pencils. A diagram of a single mother's daily transit route. 4 buses, 3 transfers. She closed the folder. This is not sentiment. It is strategy. The bill passed committee. 3 months later, it passed the House. Senators called her. "This folder," one said, "it's changing how we talk." In Chicago, a community leader created a mural, an open folder. Red paint streaked across a wall. At its base, hold stories like bricks. In El Paso, a 5th grader wrote a poem titled "Fold Me In." Jasmine read it aloud at a town hall. "I am not a footnote," it ended. "I'm a page that breathes." She added it to the folder. Then came the flood. Not just notes, but volunteers. Architects grant writers, therapists, organizers. "Tell us where to go," they said. And Jasmine replied, "Wherever a story hasn't been heard." That summer, 40 new folder rooms opened in rec centers, schools, libraries. Each had a copy of the folder. Each had a table where people could write. And Jasmine visited everyone. At each stop she sat, listened, added one line to each location's wall. "This room hears what the world missed." By fall, news anchors referred to the folder movement. University courses cited it as case study. Protesters in 6 countries held up red folders as symbols. And Jasmine, she just kept walking, folder in hand, still listening, still writing, still threading that red line through the fabric of power. One story, one silence, one voice at a time. Jasmine stood in front of a new folder room in Tulsa. The walls were painted with the words of neighborhood kids, phrases like "I matter," "Read my light and this is home." A mother came up to her with tears in her eyes, clutching her son's asthma medication receipt. She didn't speak, just handed it over. Jasmine didn't ask any questions. She added it to the folder. Later that evening, in a local news interview, she was asked, "Why do you still carry the original folder around? Isn't the digital archive safer?" She paused, looked at the camera. "Because change isn't virtual, it's visceral." The anchor blinked. Silence hung in the air again. That quote made national headlines. The weight of the red folder had begun to ache in her shoulder, but Jasmine refused to stop. Every ache reminded her why she had started. A reporter followed her for a week, writing a long-form piece titled "The Silence That Shouted." It wasn't about speeches or bills. It was about the faces in the folder. Faces like Theo 9, who wrote a letter in crayon about his dream library. Faces like Martha 63, whose water bill outpaced her income. Faces like Kevin 16, who carried a red notebook everywhere and wrote, "I'm collecting reasons to keep trying." Jasmine carried that notebook too. At a conference in Boston, an Ivy League professor dismissed her folder as emotional narrative politics. Jasmine didn't flinch. She pulled out a letter from a public school teacher in Flint who taught science without working sinks. "This is data," Jasmine said. "Just disrespected." The audience rose. She didn't smile. She moved on. But momentum didn't stop. 1 month later, in partnership with advocacy groups, Jasmine launched the Red Thread Index, an interactive public map, connecting personal stories from the folder with policy gaps. Zip code by zip code, story by story. Local leaders began using it for budget decisions. One city rerouted transit based on folder letters. Another funded a lunch program after reading about food insecurity among bus students. And still the folder grew. International attention followed. A mayor in Johannesburg started a folder wall. In São Paulo, a pop-up museum displayed red folders filled with testimonies from favela residents. And Jasmine flew to speak at the United Nations. She stood behind the podium, no slideshow, no flashy intro, just the folder. She opened it. This folder, she said, is full of people who were told their truth didn't count. Today, their truth makes law. She didn't raise her voice. The room was silent. When she finished, the translator whispered into a dozen languages, and in each one, the echo of that truth rippled. Back home, schools began teaching the folder method, a way to integrate student narratives into civics education. A high school in New Orleans renamed its library after Jasmine. In Detroit, a choir performed a piece titled "Pages We Carry," and Jasmine kept walking, kept folding, kept threading silence through the seams of society until even the halls of power had no choice but to quiet themselves and listen. It ended not with a headline, but a whisper. Jasmine sat alone in the original folder room walls, now covered with stories written by hands, small and wrinkled, strong and trembling. She turned to the final tab in the folder labeled Future. Inside, one last letter waited. It was from a 10-year-old named Raina. Just one sentence, "I hope I get to add my page too." Jasmine smiled, then closed the folder. For the first time, she felt it was full, not because there was no room, but because the world had started carrying it with her. Outside, the mural of the red folder had faded slightly in the sun, but the message still burned. Speak even when they can't hear. Jasmine stood up and left the folder on the table, not as surrender, as invitation, because some stories don't end. They echo and echo and echo. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of quiet voices and the strength of unheard stories, then join us. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone whose voice deserves to be heard. And in the comments, tell us what page would you add to the folder your story matters. Let's carry it together.